Well, welcome educators and historians and enthusiasts to this evening's joint program brought to you by the American Battlefield Trust and the Center for Civic Education. In this month dedicated to celebrating women's history, we are poised to uncover the intertwined narratives of resilience, agency, and activism. Tonight, we'll be delving into the pivotal role of women during the Civil War and how their remarkable contributions served as catalysts for the suffrage movement, ultimately culminating in the passage of the 19th Amendment. My name's Emily Voss, and I am the Senior Manager of National Programs and Professional Development at the Center for Civic Education. And I'm joined by Sarah Beerley, who serves as Education Associate at the American Battlefield Trust and is a published author dedicated to the study of the Civil War. We're really eager for your participation in tonight's program, and we welcome your questions and your comments in the chat throughout. Sarah and I will be engaging with you in the chat, and we'll also leave plenty of time for Q&A. So without further ado, Sarah will be kicking things off this evening.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm actually adding one more video link to the chat right now. So there's a link to a primary source I'm going to be talking about. I've just added a link to a brand new video that American Battlefield Trust released about women in the American Civil War. It's just 4 minutes. So if you need a 4-minute overview on that, we've got you covered there. And excited to be here. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to share my screen and take it away to some Civil War history. So American Battlefield Trust is a nonprofit. We're based out of Washington, D.C., but we preserve battlefield land across the country in 25 states. We've saved more than 58,000 acres of land. And our mission is to preserve, educate, and inspire. So that's where the education department comes in. And I'm privileged to be able to work with teachers across the country, helping to develop lesson plans and do collaborations like this, tours. We have programs that help provide funding to take your classrooms, students out to battlefields, museums, historic sites, and we are super excited to be able to be doing that. So I would encourage you to visit our website, battlefields.org, to learn more about what we offer for educators for free. Tonight, we're going to be looking at some Civil War history, women's history, and how this ties into the questions of citizenship, the questions of suffrage, and how it flows together in a theme of that we find in American history and in women's history as well. So I'm going to kind of set some groundwork. We're going to work through some history of the American Civil War and placing it in women's history context as well. So when we get to the American Civil War, which begins in 1861, ends in 1865, that comes right in the middle of a big discussion that people in the United States are already having about women's rights, about social reform, about abolition, about all of these different changes, societal movements that are happening in mid-19th century America. And in some ways, at first glance, to a lot of the women who are at the heart of the women's movement or suffrage movement, women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, the Civil War looks like they have to step on the brakes with what they're trying to do for women's rights and women's suffrage. But in many ways, the Civil War becomes this catalyst because it's allowing women to step into new roles. It's allowing men to see women in a new light, taking on new leadership roles. And so the Civil War becomes this very pivotal moment, but you got to dig a little deeper to find it there in the story. Tonight, I'm going to be talking mostly about women's history from the Northern perspective or the Union perspective. So the Northern states, the Union states, the ones siding with Abraham Lincoln, kind of, sort of, mostly. I will talk a little bit about what's going on in the Southern states in the Confederacy, those states that have declared themselves out of the Union and are carrying on the war there. But I do want to just bring that up front and make it clear. So In 1848, few years before the Civil War begins, there's the Seneca Falls Convention. And from that comes the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, authored mostly by Elizabeth Stanton. And it kind of becomes this rallying document for women's rights and women's suffrage. So that's already happened. This idea is already on the minds of people by 1861. And we're going to find diverse perspectives as we look at the women, war, and the questions of citizenship. So hopefully my screen just changed. Could you give me a thumbs up, Emily, if it worked well? Okay, excellent. As I was working on putting together this program, I wanted to pull together some resources that you might be able to use as educators. And there is a PDF document with a bunch of links to biographies about women, roles of women in the Civil War, and some primary sources that I believe Emily's going to share with you after the meeting. So be looking for that. But in the meantime, if you want to reference the primary source that I'm going to be mostly talking about in the next few minutes, you can find that in the chat. And it's actually the introduction to a book that's called Women's Work in the Civil War. And this book, it's a few hundred pages. It's a very big volume. But what's significant about it is it's published in 1867, so 2 years after the Civil War ends. And it's collecting these stories of women and what they did during the Civil War. And it's not comprehensive. There are certainly areas we can look at and go, some stories were left out. I wonder why. And we'll get to that a little later in the presentation. But the introduction to this book is really fantastic. And that's what that primary source is that I've put in the chat. It's long, so I'm not going to take you through it line by line, but I'm going to use it as my framework because this introduction to this significant volume, Women's Work in the Civil War, the introduction is written by a minister named Henry W. Bellows. His image is there on the screen. And he was in the reform movements of the era. He's part of the civilian war work that's happening. And he observed and worked with a lot of women who were stepping into leadership roles, who were running businesses, if you will. Even though they weren't making money, they were running huge nonprofits. They were fundraising millions of dollars for the Union war effort. And he saw these women doing this. He saw women volunteering and stepping into hospitals, stepping into roles outside the traditional sphere of the home. And so he writes about this in his introduction. And what we really find, and what he also alludes to, is that there are questions that are rising in society, and even more so by seeing what women did during the Civil War. Are they citizens? If they are citizens, what rights do they have as citizens? And he is making an argument from a male perspective that these women have done incredible work for their country. What does that mean next? He starts to allude to that in parts of his introduction as he lays out all these things that he's observed. And really, citizenship is in the balance for a lot of people during the Civil War. We find Irish American immigrants saying that they're enlisting, they're fighting for their new homeland. They want to be recognized as citizens. They want to be given respect. We see German American immigrants doing that as well. It's very important to them. And then after 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation, which President Lincoln signs, African American men are able to formally enlist in the United States Army and Navy. And they also see their military service as a way to prove themselves as worthy of citizenship. So there's a lot of citizenship questions hanging in the balance during the Civil War, as well as the question of, should women be able to have full rights as citizens? So this book, Women's Work in the Civil War, is written by Linus P. Brockett and Mary C. Vaughn. They're the authors. They gather a lot of biographies about women working in the Sanitary Commission, which I'll explain in a moment, ladies' aid societies, and then there's biographies of nurses, of society organizers, of daughters of the regiment, of Southern loyalists, and officers' wives. So they really tried to pull together a lot of stories. So one of the quotes that we'll pull, hopefully, let's see, my There we go. So drawing some quotes here, some ideas from Henry Bellow's introduction. One of the phrases he uses is woman's extending the sphere of her life and labors. So you're probably familiar with the spheres of influence that are talked about, that are used in ideology, in theory of what society should be in the 19th century, that women are typically in charge of the home, raising the children. Men are out making their way in the world, doing business, doing the heavy work of farming, and things like that. And what I've found over the last few years, reading lots of different primary sources, is that that looks really good on paper and it translates really well into the magazines of the day. But when we actually look at real families, there is some crossover. You find women stepping into the store that the family is running to take part in that business. We find men helping out with the children when they get home from work in the evenings. And so there's some crossover. It's not quite as separate as we might want to think it is. But traditionally, women are in the home role. They're taking care of the children, they're taking care of the home, they're perhaps involved with church or some local charity groups. But that's about the extent of their spheres of influence, as it's sometimes called. And we find that the Civil War is going to have women pushing those boundaries in some very large ways and also some small ways. It might just be that the woman is now having to make a lot more decisions about her household. How are they going to be able to afford rent? Things like that, if her husband is away at war. Or it might be larger things like literally stepping outside the home to take on a role with an organization or perhaps supporting the military directly. So keep that in mind. Also, women have a lot of influence, and this is something that Henry Bellows mentions a lot in his introduction, his primary source there. He says they shamed recruits into the ranks. And this is a really interesting thing to think about. He's talking about women's influence on the morale. He's referencing the North. It also carries true in the South, in the Confederacy as well. And on the screen over on the left, you can see this image that appeared in Harper's Weekly. And the bottom part, the caption part is cut off, but it says in the original, the gentleman, he's coming home and he says, "My dear, I found a substitute," meaning that he's found another man to go and be a soldier. And we see the woman kind of putting her hand out to stop him there. And her reply in the original is, "My dear, I found a substitute for you." Which is pretty bold. It's funny, it's satire, but it's giving us this idea. Women were very patriotic, and there was there were the ideas that if the men weren't volunteering to go be part of the patriotic cause to preserve the Union or to abolish slavery, depending on the particular views of the community, that was kind of shameful. Their manhood was almost called into question, their masculinity at least. So we do see women in a lot of the scenes, the sketches of regiments going to war. They're on the sidelines cheering the boys on. There's both a positive and a negative part of their encouragement of the war effort. And we see this morale in both the Union side and the Confederacy as well. One of the things that's often talked about is as the war begins to go badly for the Confederacy by 1864, 1865, there are women writing, or Southern women writing to their Confederate soldiers and saying, there's no food at home. Your children are starving. You need to leave the army and come home. And when letters like that were being sent, the officers would notice a lot of desertion happening. So women do control a lot of the morale, a lot of the encouragement, if you will, for the war effort, or the breaking of that morale. Now, in another very practical way, we find women forming soldiers' aid societies. And Henry Bellows writes, "Soldiers' aid societies and sewing circles, which the women held, where they talked over the national causes and fed the fires of sacrifice in each other's hearts." So he's seeing these gatherings of women coming together. And think of this in your small community, your social circle, your town, your village, or perhaps a district of a city where you live. These these women are coming together to do sewing, to do knitting, and they're talking over the national events of the day. Women are coming together, they're taking a big notice in what's happening, and partly because their loved ones are involved. It's not just, oh, my, cousin 2 times removed is a congressman, so I'm kinda sorta interested in government. No, this is a case of my brother, my husband, my, father is involved in a war that has political outcomes. It matters who's elected if this war continues. It matters who's elected for what meaning is going to be attached to this war. Will there be a victory that keeps the country together? Will there be a victory that is going to lead to the abolition of slavery? And these are things that women are discussing amongst themselves and also in letters to men. So there's that thought, if you will, the ideology around the soldiers' aid societies, but then there's also the very practical side. Who's making the stockings that the soldiers in the armies are marching through? Oh, the women are knitting them. Who's making the new shirts? Who's, in some cases, making the uniforms or other things that are needed? You're going to find a lot of that with the soldiers' aid societies. Yes, there are certain things that soldiers are issued that come from the government themselves. And sometimes women were paid to sew those uniforms and things like that. But a lot of the practical things that are going to be closest to the soldier, those are being made by the women at home, sometimes sent directly to those soldiers, sometimes sent through larger aid organizations. What begins to happen is these soldiers' aid societies are then going to start channeling what they're producing, those stockings, those shirts, those quilts, toward larger organizations that are able to easier or in a more easy fashion distribute those goods to the soldiers who need them. It's one thing to have everybody on your street pack a box and send it to a soldier. But what if you're all knitting stockings and then you send it to a larger organization who's able to compile it with lots of stockings that have been knit by soldiers' aid societies all across your part or region in the country? And then get those quickly and efficiently to the camp where the soldiers need them. And that's what we find happening. And it's going to happen in both the North and the South. Now, we're going to talk about the South first because they decide to put their organizational level only at the state level. So you might have ladies' aid societies happening or gathering in Georgia, and they're just going to compile all of their stuff to the Georgia Relief and Hospital Association, which is going to take care of delivering those supplies to regiments of soldiers from the state of Georgia. Now, they're not going to share their supplies from Georgia with soldiers from, say, Louisiana or Virginia, because they're taking care of the Georgia boys. It's part of this states' rights idea that the Confederacy is trying to hold on to. Is it effective? Yes, in some ways, but there's not an overall overarching way of organizing, and it's very much we take care of our state. Now, in the North, they go for a national organization. There's actually a few of them. The largest one is the United States Sanitary Commission, which has a great name, and you definitely have to explain it when you're talking about it with kids, because otherwise they're going to think that a bunch of portable pot or portable toilets were delivered by this commission. Well, that's not exactly what they were doing. However, the United States Sanitary Commission was looking after the cleanliness of soldiers' camps. They're supposed to be helping to keep soldiers healthy, keep these armies in the field. And the Sanitary Commission is going to do that in a number of different ways. The concept for the Sanitary Commission actually comes from some women in the very early days of the Civil War. But then they send some guys to Washington, D.C., and the guys come back with ideas for a very different plan. Regardless, the United States Sanitary Commission is established in the summer of 1861. It is formally endorsed by the United States government, but it is handled and run privately. They're going to be looking after how are camps established, how's the health of soldiers, how do we gather supplies to support the armies. And this is going to turn into a huge organization. And women are in charge of a lot of the organizing and a lot of the running of this commission. So they are organizing, they are sending agents into military camps to look after how's the cleanliness of this camp. Hence, we get the name Sanitary Commission. They're making recommendations to officers. And at first, officers are really indignant. Why are a bunch of civilians coming and telling us how to run our camps? And then, as their soldiers start getting sick and having problems with disease, they go, oh, maybe we should listen to those guys. Also, the Sanitary Commission begins to make itself popular because they're able to bring in those extra supplies that the US government is not quickly providing to the Army. So they're able to kind of fill that gap, if you will. So, where's the Sanitary Commission getting their supplies? They're organizing at various levels. There's the national level, there's regional levels, there's state levels, there's local levels. They're bringing together all those little soldier aid societies and saying, all right, that's great that you knit 100 stockings. Come join with us, and we're going to be able to get those moved to the troops very quickly. The Sanitary Commission also does major fundraising. We're talking millions of dollars, and we're talking involvement with states all across the Union. The state that provides the most money for the Sanitary Commission is actually California. So if there's any West Coasters on this call, this is a really neat way to tie your state into Civil War history. I grew up in California, so I'm always looking for a West Coast little fun fact to be able to throw in there. So they're raising these millions of dollars in 1864. That's the really big year for what are called the Sanitary Commission fairs. They're these huge, think like county fairs, state fairs, people coming together to see patriotic exhibits. George Washington's tent, his uniform, his sword are put on display and traveled across the country to all these different places, along with uniforms from popular Civil War generals and all different kinds of artifacts. We could do a whole program on the sanitary fairs, and those really big ones were happening exactly 160 years ago. It's another fun little tie-in, maybe something you might want to research on your own. With that funding, the commission is buying more supplies. They're also able to pay to send agents, to send doctors, to send nurses, both male and female nurses, out to the armies, to the camps, to the hospitals. They establish hospital ships that are able to move sick and wounded soldiers from the fighting areas to the more established hospitals in cities. So this is a huge effort, and women are involved with it. And Henry Bellows, in his introduction, takes great pains to point out that women organized their correspondence and they wrote letters and they were so organized, you would almost think they could do business. And we read that now, and like I was reading, I was like, I don't know if I should be offended but you understand that he's coming from a perspective of admiration. And maybe he hasn't thought that women could be involved in this type of organizing and business before. So try to see it that way, the way he intends it. Let's talk a little bit about what probably most people think about when we talk about women in the Civil War, and that is medical service or nursing. Now, women stepping out of the home, volunteering, or getting paid to go work at a military hospital was pretty revolutionary. Hospitals were not a nice place. Hospitals were where people went if they couldn't afford medical care at home. So they tended to be associated with lower class, which in 19th century mind might mean crime, might mean loose morals. There's just a lot of stigma around hospitals prior to the Civil War. Now that has to start shifting because all of a sudden, both North and South, brave, noble soldiers are in hospitals. Suddenly, hospitals are starting to look like, oh, they're patriotic. It's okay to be taken care of in a hospital. So, from a medical perspective, that's a big shift. And it's something that carries over even into our thinking today. Like, it's okay to go to a hospital. Hospital is not a bad place. Some of that comes out of thinking with the Civil War. But for women, there's this big debate in the 1860s. Is a hospital a proper place for a woman? Because you've got all these wounded guys, and Some of them can't get out of bed. They need critical care nursing. Is it appropriate for a woman to be there, to be taking care of a man who is not part of her immediate family? It's a big question. It's a question that carries moral implications. Sometimes it becomes religious implications. There's a lot of layers to this debate that's happening. But women had an argument of their own to say, yes, we belong here. And their argument was at home, when the baby gets sick, when the teenager gets sick, when my husband gets sick, who takes care of that sick person? It's the women, it's the mother, it's the sister, maybe the daughter. So they're drawing on this idea from that traditional sphere of womanhood that we take care of those who are ill or hurt. We have that compassion, we have that woman's touch and sympathy that's so important for empathy and recovery and all of that. So that's the argument that they're making. And it takes some time because there were a number of men who did in medical service who did not want women there. Women kind of have to prove themselves to be capable and put up with a lot of what we would call today discrimination or outright abuse that they encounter as they go into the hospital setting. But women do it. And they're going to enter the hospital service in a number of different ways. There will be women who go in as actual nurses, and that would be like traditional giving medicine, bandaging wounds, assisting doctors, things like that. There were also positions as hospital matrons. Think of this as like the organizers, doing the housekeeping, making sure that things are kept tidy, organized, that there's enough supplies on hand. There's women volunteering in the kitchens. Some are getting paid. Sometimes it's free African American women finding jobs working in these hospital kitchens, cooking special diet meals that are needed, that are ordered by the doctors. And they're starting to, as they do these jobs well, they're starting to earn the respect of the men who are like, yay, we don't have to cook anymore. Like the women have got it now. So there's some interesting dynamics going on there for sure. Referring back to the primary source that we're talking about, Henry Bellow's introduction to women's war work, he writes, moved by an indomitable desire to serve in person the victims of wounds and sickness, a few hundred women, impelled by instincts which assured them of their ability to endure hardship, overcome the obstacles, and adjust themselves to the unusual and unfeminine circumstances in which they would be placed, made their way through all obstacles at home and at the seat of war or in the hospitals to the bedsides of the sick and wounded men. Many of these women scandalized their friends at home by their resolution, or they left their families under circumstances which involved the romantic oblivion of the recognized and usual duties of domestic life. They forsook their own children to make children of a whole army corps. They risked their lives in fevered hospitals. They lived in tents or slept in ambulance wagons for months together. They fell sick of fevers themselves, and after long illnesses, returned to the old business of hospital and field service. They carried into their work their womanly tenderness, their copious sympathies, and their great-hearted devotion. So there's women serving in the established hospitals, and then there's a few women who are keeping themselves near the base of the armies in the field, as it talks about in our primary source here. So these are women who are usually with the Sanitary Commission or some other official capacity, and they are getting close to the armies. They are there in those field hospitals, closer to the battle lines, part of that kind of first aid, first operate medical operations that are happening for the soldiers. And some will go independently, kind of force of their own, getting supplies to these areas close to the fighting. Think of Clara Barton. Clara Barton is probably one of the best known battlefield nurses. She's able to get supply wagons right up into the fighting areas. Sometimes she's under fire as she's coming to these field hospital areas. On the screen, we don't have action pictures of Clara Barton, but these are actually women who were volunteering with the Sanitary Commission, going going right out, right near these field hospitals, near the battlefields themselves. In the PDF that Emily will share with you later, there's biographies of a lot of these nurses. So if you want to have your students be able to do some extra research on them, there's some great resources linked in there as well. Most women, though, did not volunteer as nurses and run into hospitals or out toward battlefields. The vast majority of women, North and South, are going to be dealing with the war, supporting the war, dealing with the war's challenges on the home front. Because when someone enlists to be a soldier, those who leave behind, that's the home front, the civilian home front. They felt all the impulses of home, strengthening their arms and encouraging their hearts, is the way Henry Bellows describes the influence of the home front on the soldiers. And I talked earlier about the influence of morale, but think about just the daily life challenges. Think about things that we encounter today and how much more difficult it would have been then. If we're doing laundry today, all right, they had to do laundry then too. They didn't have washing machines. They're out doing the work, or they're going to have to hire someone to do the work. What about cooking meals? This is a day to day, lots of work that women do normally. But then they're taking on new roles while the men are away. They're having to figure out how to pay the rent. Who am I going to hire to harvest the fields? Things like that. So think about that additional burden that women are taking on, and they're managing it really, really well in most cases. It surprises me how many letters, and this goes mostly for North and South, husbands are writing to their wives and saying, "You are managing well." There's actually one soldier, Confederate soldier from Virginia. He's teasing his wife, but he says, "Hey, I'm going to let you run the farm when I come back because you know more about it than I do, and you've made a better profit with the crops this year." Tragically, he doesn't come home, so she's going to have to take care of that family for the rest of her life. But we have women in the North as well who are making business decisions, who are keeping those family businesses, the farms, operating on their own. And they're doing that, and they're writing thousands of letters going between the soldiers in the camps and the home front, both directions. And that's where we find the morale and these discussions that men and women are having. What's the role? How is this shifting as the war continues? These are things that are definitely now forced into people's minds just by the sheer necessity of women's roles changing, either voluntarily or because of circumstance as the war is unfolding. Henry Bellows writes that the rights, duties, and capacities, I'll add, of women are now under serious discussion. So he's writing this in 1867, and he's acknowledging that women have shifting roles. Now, in the big national scheme, if you will, what are the women advocating for suffrage doing during the Civil War years? They form the Women's Loyal National League, which is the first official political organization of women in the United States. That's really significant. And, excuse me, this Loyal National League focuses on advocating for putting an amendment in the Constitution to officially abolish slavery. And they're going to collect hundreds of thousands of signatures for a petition to that effect. And while they're doing that very noble service, they're also reminding everybody the only thing that women can do right now is petition the government. We can't actually vote, but we have a voice and we're petitioning. This is all we can do right now. Don't we deserve to vote? That's kind of the theme that they're starting to pull in a little bit. Now, Henry Bellows's introduction is really great, and as you can see, we've pulled a lot of themes out of it, but he certainly misses a few stories and a few things that we should talk about as it ties into questions of citizenship and women's rights. So who's missing in his introduction, and who's missing in that book as a whole? As I mentioned, it's a fabulous book, hundreds of pages of records of stories about women and their war efforts. But significantly, it's missing stories about female soldiers in the actual military ranks. It's missing stories about African American women and their experiences. And it's missing stories about suffragettes and about social reform activists who aren't conforming to, say, the patriotic roles that are acceptable in the Civil War era. So I want to take just a few minutes here. I think I'm on time, on target for you. Um, so we'll take just a few minutes and talk about those stories that are missing. And it's going to lead, I think, really well into this larger discussion of citizenship that Emily is going to be leading for us. So, female soldiers. Now, with historical research, we know that at least 750 women disguised themselves, cut their hair short, put on uniforms, and served in military ranks. That's a pretty big number. Now, when we put it in the grand scheme of the thousands of men who served, it's small by percentage. But think about 750 women. If a full strength Civil War regiment was supposed to be 1,000 men, there's probably at least a regiment of women by the numbers. Now, they were obviously weren't all serving together, but we think about it that way. If we know there were 750, there's probably a few more, maybe many more, that we don't know about. So we can kind of keep that in mind. Some of these female soldiers were discovered, forced out of the ranks. Some were not discovered, though. Some went on, survived the war, did not resume a female identity, continued living with a male name, cross-dressing in men's clothing, and enjoying in some ways the independence that they had of being able to make money, of not being forced into marriage and things like that. So a lot of stories to consider. The women here on the screen, in their photographs of them as they dressed in their military service, we have Sarah Emma Edmonds. She was a northern soldier, Union soldier. She also did some spying. Apparently, the men never quite figured out how she was so good in her female disguises. At least that's according to her memoirs. Sarah Loretta Wakeman actually dies of illness during her military service. She is buried in a national cemetery down near New Orleans. She is buried, though, under her male name, the name she enlisted under. Loretta Janetta Valaquez, she serves in the Confederacy, disguised herself. If I remember correctly, she actually makes rank of lieutenant. There's lots of stories like this, lots of really interesting resources to follow up with. But this is leading into those questions of there's more rights for these women if they're dressing in men's clothes. They're getting a soldier's pay. If they decided to stay in male attire, if you will, they can apply for pensions. They can get better jobs. There's more opportunities for them. So these are things that are going to at least come into individual women's thinking, even though this isn't necessarily going to come boldly into the full discussion. But it is significant to point out that when Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are working on their what becomes a 6-volume work called The History of Women's Suffrage, they write about the female soldiers of the Civil War. This is what they said in their history of women's suffrage. They say that historians, quote, made no mention of women's services during the war. That's true, though, and they go on and say hundreds of women marched steadily up to the mouth of 100 cannon, pouring out fire and smoke, shot and shell, mowing down the advancing hosts like grass. Men, horses, and colors going down in confusion, disappearing in the clouds of smoke. The only sound, the screaming of shells, the crackling of musketry, the thundering of artillery. Through all this, women were sustained by the enthusiasm born of love and country and liberty. So we find leaders of the women's suffrage movement recognizing these female soldiers, using their experiences in their history, and acknowledging the contributions of these female soldiers during the Civil War. Let's talk a little bit about African American women. For many Black women, they are freedom seekers, or they have freedom coming to them during the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation is going to be one of the first steps of that. Even earlier in the war, there were some proclamations that said, if you make it to the lines of Union soldiers, United States troops, you will have freedom and not be returned to your enslavers. That's very significant. That's going to present women with choices. Do we run to freedom, or do we stay in slavery? For many, they're going to choose freedom, be able to take their children and seek a new life. Now, that new life is often hard. There's a lot of decisions that they have to make, there's a lot of unknowns. But many of these freedom seekers are able to find employment with the Union Army. For the women, that might be as cooks, it might be as laundresses, or other forms of what was called female manual labor, but they're able to be employed. And for some women, this is their employment for the first time. And that's going to be part of their journey to and through freedom. Um, it's also, as they are freed, many of them are going to start wondering, what about our families? Because if their families didn't go to freedom with them, a lot of these women want to find their children who may have been sold away into other parts of a state or the country. And so, as more and more um, areas of the South come under Union liberation, that's going to be more of an opportunity for families to perhaps be able to find each other and reunite. There's a lot of questions that women need to think about. There's a lot that they have to navigate because if it's a difficult society for white women, it's even more challenging for African American women, even as they are enjoying this new freedom. It's not a freedom that is always safe or easy to navigate. And there are many leaders, African American female leaders that are worthy of study. I've highlighted just three on the screen. Harriet Tubman, who I'm sure you are familiar with, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping people find freedom before the Civil War. She actually works with the Union Army, does some spying missions, helps to coordinate an attack for some Union soldiers during the Civil War itself. And she'll be one of those voices of advocacy during the war and afterwards as well. Sojourner Truth, definitely a suffragette. She is advocating, speaking, touring, helping people across the North to see she's a woman. She wants to be treated as a white woman, but then she's also saying, but white women aren't even treated real well. Why don't we have universal respect? Why don't we have universal rights? And what about universal voting? So she's bringing that theme into the conversation about abolition as well. And Susie King Taylor, she publishes some significant works about her experience enslaved, her experience with the Union Army, and she will also become a powerful advocate as well. Finally, we come to some of the women who we might term suffragettes or women advocating for women's suffrage. I've highlighted just four on the screen. There's many more that we could talk about, but we have Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucy Stone. And these are the women who are going to be part of forming that loyal league, part of organizing that petition for the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. They are beginning to realize that there's an opportunity to make their voices heard. And although it might start off advocating for abolition, that's going to lead into those bigger discussions about citizenship, about voting. There will be huge splits over the theories of how do we get there that will happen in the post-war years between some of these women, these powerful advocates here on the screen. They don't all see a same path for an amendment to the Constitution that would lead to women be able to vote. And there's a lot of debate about that as amendments are coming into place for citizenship, of voting rights for African American men, but women are being excluded. How do you respond to that? What do you do with that? These are questions that these women, these thinkers, are grappling with as the Civil War is happening and as it's coming to its end. One more thing that I want to point out, women during the Civil War era are taking significant political interest. We kind of touched on this talking about the ladies' aid societies. In a number of letter collections that I've been reading over the years, it's really remarkable how many women are writing and saying during the election years, 1862 and 1864, 1864 being the presidential election year, they say that they're going to political rallies. They're taking huge interest, and some of them are even saying for the first time in the political happenings of the day. And they're writing to their male family members or friends and telling them about going to these rallies, about going to hear political speeches, and what they think about them. One wife goes so far as, and I'm sure there were more, but this particular letter collection, this wife writes to her husband, and she has decided who she would vote for in the 1864 election if she could. And her husband, he's like, yeah, that'd be a good vote. Like, you've thought this out. I'd be supportive of you voting. So this is coming into the dialogue, coming into what people are writing about, what people are thinking about during the Civil War years. And it's that tie, that connection of we're involved in a war. The people, the men that we love have gone to fight. Decisions that are made politically are going to affect what they might have to do or the meaning that is attached to this war. And women are taking a big interest in that. I think that's something really significant to think about as we look at then what happens in the last half of the 19th century and into the early 20th century with women's movements. So I'll just conclude with a final quote from Henry Bellow's Introduction to Women's War Work. He said, "It is not unusual for women of all countries to weep and to work for those who encounter the perils of war. But the American women, after giving up with a principled alacrity to the ranks of the gathering and advancing army, their husbands and sons, their brothers and lovers, proceeded to organize relief for them. And they did it not in a spasmodic and sentimental way, which has been common elsewhere, but with self controlled and rational consideration of the wisest and best means of accomplishing their purpose, which showed them to be, in some degree, the products and representatives of a new social era and a new political development." And I'll turn it back to Emily. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was such a great overview. And I mean, I, for one, really appreciate being able to focus specifically on the women's experience because it's a much more diverse experience than I think most of us have a real sense of. So I'm looking forward to seeing folks' questions at the end of our presentation this evening. But for my part, I'm going to basically pick up where Sarah left off and talk a little bit more about the citizenship elements, and then dive into an activity that the Center for Civic Education has available free for use. All right, so thinking in terms of citizenship and suffrage, I wanted to start very briefly by talking about the word citizenship itself. So I think it's really important, especially when we're talking with students, for them to have an understanding of what citizenship is and what are the elements that one could actually participate in of citizenship that are not necessarily limited to voting. Students really tend to have that knee-jerk reaction when we talk about, well, you know, what makes someone behave as a citizen? Oh, they vote. Like, yes, and there are a lot of other ways that a person could demonstrate citizenship. So I've highlighted just a few here that you may already highlight with your students, but some things that a participatory citizen could do would be work within their communities, demonstrate civic responsibility, have social and political awareness, have respect for diversity, and work towards environmental stewardship. So some examples being volunteering, participating in local meetings, obeying laws, paying taxes, jury service, being informed, evaluating information, treating others with dignity and respect, and conserving of resources. And I think in Sarah's really excellent overview of women and their position in society, and specifically during the Civil War, how many of those examples did she talk about? So women as volunteers, women being informed what was going on in society, women treating others with dignity and respect, whether it was actively involved in nursing or supporting soldiers in the field, or whether this was a joint effort towards suffrage after the end of the Civil War. So all of these different ways, women were demonstrating citizenship without the formal right to vote. And then, of course, fighting for suffrage in and of itself is also an act of citizenship. So clearly, democratic participation allows women ultimately to have a voice in the laws that govern their lives. So obviously very important there. But also being civically engaged, activism, public demonstrations, lobbying efforts, and civil disobedience that we see in the early 20th century, all of these things are going to raise awareness and mobilize support to ultimately influence lawmakers to pass the 19th Amendment. Women are also working on civil rights advocacy. So Sarah certainly mentioned this. For a long time, efforts towards civil rights and efforts towards women's suffrage were entwined efforts. So these were efforts that were essentially saying equality under law should be a thing that everyone enjoys. And then lastly, I'll point out that the legal and political activism element allows women and their allies to utilize strategies including litigation and lobbying and coalition building. So all of these different varied efforts towards the ultimate goal of suffrage are all acts of citizenship as well. So I think it's just really nice to be able to kind of piece apart where we see citizenship in all of those different stories. All right. Now, the resource that I wanted to bring up this evening from the Center for Civic Ed is called Civil Discourse and American Legacy Toolkit. This is free and available on our website, as you see on the link down below, civiced.org/civil discourse. And this is a 5-module curriculum, which is intended for college students, but could very easily be used by high school teachers. And there's a lot of great opportunities to bring discourse into your classroom. All of these different modules feature inquiry-based lessons. There's very specific plans that you can follow for use in a classroom or outside of a classroom. There are multiple resources linked in each of the different modules, and you'll find key resources linked directly, as well as downloadable texts if you happen to need them. And then there's also a lot of different recorded demonstrations that show you different activities that you can do in the classroom. So this is what the main page looks like. And as you see, one of the 5 modules is dedicated to women's rights. And so that's what we'll focus on this evening. So as you see here, the overall module concept is meant to encourage students to start from the point of the Seneca Falls Convention and to work up to modern day questions of women's rights. All of these lessons are built around the 5 E's. So many of the educators will be very familiar with this process and this concept, but the lessons proceed through the same flow, which is engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. And we'll see that in greater detail in just a minute. So as we dig into the women's rights module, our engage question is, what rights did women not have at the time of the Seneca Falls Convention? So you might pose this question to your students or your group that you're working with. And certainly voting is going to come up immediately, but there's also a whole host of other rights that were not accessible to women in 1848. Among others, married women had no property rights. Most occupations are being closed to women. When women do have paid work, they are paid a fraction of what men are paid. Women are strictly barred from certain professions, including medicine and law, and women are, with very few exceptions, barred from affairs of the church. So there are a number of other examples, but you can think about this list just in comparison to the changes that women were able to undertake during the Civil War era and see, really just how momentous that event was for women's rights. Now you would proceed in this particular module with an engage activity where you look much more closely at the Declaration of Sentiments written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her fellow allies in Seneca Falls. So you would provide your students the time to look over that document, to highlight vocabulary words, and to discuss those vocabulary words as a group. Then you'd get into an opportunity to explore that document more deeply. So here's where we do have some linked additional resources that you would be able to easily draw upon for the lesson. So I will play these, they're very short. We have this other terrific resource called 60-Second Civics. And so all of these little snips are just over 60 seconds long. So I will leave it to Dr. Lisa Tetro on the Seneca Falls Convention. So we'll play that.
Welcome to 60-Second Civics, the daily podcast of the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage. You're joined once again by our special guest, Lisa Tetro, Associate Professor of History at Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Tetro, what was the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, and how does it relate to the Declaration of Independence?
At that first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, the women didn't quite know how to organize the event, and so they decided to write a kind of manifesto beforehand. And they spent a couple days casting about for a model. How should they write this? And they eventually decided to write it in the vein of the Declaration of Independence. And they began, for example, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And then they went on, and instead of listing grievances against the king, as the original declaration had, they list grievances against man, his crimes against women, not allowing them to own property, for example, not allowing them access to the professions, barring education, barring the franchise, the lack of equal wages. And they modeled it after the Declaration of Independence, partly to make a claim to that legacy of freedom and that legacy of rights that had been denied so many people but laid out in the founding.
Thank you so much for joining us again today, Dr. Tetro. That's all for today's podcast. 60 seconds.
All right, so you can see how that would be just a great conversation starter with your students, particularly by posing the question I have here ahead of time. So how were the Declaration of Sentiments both reflective of and challenging of societal norms and inequalities? So such an interesting question to kick off, especially given what the professor mentions, which is women are, at the Seneca Falls Convention, are utilizing a framework for expressing grievance that is very familiar to other Americans. And at the same time, claiming, like, we're using this document because we too are included in this document. So I think that's brilliant and perfectly encapsulated.
Welcome to 60 Seconds Civic.
There we go. So further on, as an option then to enhance the students' exploration, you could also ask them to look more carefully at the Equal Rights Amendment and compare it and contrast it to the Declaration of Sentiments. So if you were to look at the two documents closely, what might we learn about the landscape of women's rights in the early half of the 19th century compared to the early half of the 20th century when the Equal Rights Amendment is first proposed? So also, in the interest of it being short and really interesting, I'm going to play this one too.
Welcome to 60 Second Civics, the daily podcast of the Center for Civic Education. I'm Mark Gage. We're joined today by special guest Lisa Tatro, Associate Professor of History at Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Tatro, it's been nearly a century since the Equal Rights Amendment was first proposed. What is the ERA, and how would ratification of this amendment to the Constitution change American life?
The ERA is fascinating. It's the Equal Rights Amendment, and it's an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. It was proposed much earlier than many people think. It was proposed in 1923 in the aftermath of the victory of the 19th Amendment, the so-called Women's Suffrage Amendment. That amendment had said no discrimination in voting on the basis of sex. And so a variety of women thought, let's continue with this constitutional revolution and say no discrimination in anything on the basis of sex. And it's gone through various wordings over the time, but the idea is essentially that it would make sex discrimination an unconstitutional act. It has been introduced in Congress every year for a long time, beginning in 1923. It was proposed by Crystal Eastman and Alice Paul, a former suffragist, and it finally passed Congress in 1972. It then went to the states for ratification, fell short, got an extension, and then there started to be a very active anti-ERA campaign led by someone named Phyllis Schlafly. And then the entire thing fell apart and was never passed or never amended. It was never ratified and added to the Constitution by the states. There is now an effort underway to do that. Whether or not it will succeed remains to be seen. And what an ERA would do is going to be up largely to the ingenuity of the people and the interpretations of the court.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, so, once again, this is an opportunity to bring in a comparison to an earlier document and have the students kind of wrestle with how are things different, what is the efforts underway during the early 19th century compared to the early 20th century to gain allies to the cause for women's rights and women's equality.
Welcome to 60 Second Civics.
All right, so essentially you would continue moving through the model by building additional background knowledge of the students through these close readings of text, in addition to other resources as well. And everything is downloadable. And to really open things up for a deeper understanding for the students, the module then encourages you as the educator to utilize either a Paideia seminar or a structured academic controversy. So the Paideia seminar is a very collaborative, thought-provoking dialogue, which will allow a very close read of a specific document and then allow students to further activate their connections between the Seneca Falls Convention and long-term impacts. And a structured academic controversy, by comparison, would allow the students to take a particular position. And the example we have here is, did the Seneca Falls Convention meet its goals? Discuss. So really interesting just in its own right, but we could certainly complicate that question based on what we've discussed today to say, if the Seneca Falls Convention didn't meet its goals in 1848, how did the Civil War advance the goals initially set forth in Seneca Falls in 1848? So you could do quite a lot with that. And both of the models, the structured academic controversy and the Paideia seminar, we have examples for you to see how to do that if those are methods that you are not already familiar with. Now, I wanted to kind of revisit what that module could look like with modifications based on today's content. So it's really easy content to change. And I think Sarah has presented us with such good material that it would be good to just discuss how you can make minor tweaks to the women's rights module on our page and have a really impressive discussion with your students. So within the space of introduction and the setting of context, you would certainly want to establish with students through discussion or some other background reading what is the point that we are at in 1848 when it comes to limitations of women's participation in public life. We talked earlier, or I spoke earlier, about elements of citizenship that women are still enacting, even if they don't have a lot of legal rights. They're still very much part of the community, and their actions as part of a community certainly do allow them some freedoms and some understandings of citizenship. So then you can connect women's role directly then to their wartime experiences. So with additional text readings, with additional videos, we can highlight women's significant contributions in spite of legal barriers that society may have. And then, as Sarah did, you could certainly use the front half of tonight's video as a terrific resource because we have so many examples that could be pointed to in terms of women's contributions during wartime. Further, then, we can certainly analyze primary text. We can always start with the Declaration of Sentiments, but then we can utilize some of those other primary documents that Sarah shared in the follow-up PDF that we have for you. But also, if you wanted to access that terrific book, even just excerpts from that book, I think would also be terrific point-to-point comparisons with students. All right, and then as far as structured inquiry activities goes, the students could do their Paideia seminar focusing on questions like, how might the limitations on women's rights discussed in Seneca Falls impact women's roles in wartime? So what were their demands? And then what similarities or differences might we see between 19th century challenges to women's engagement, both in society and specifically in a time of war? How do we see that compared to the modern era? So what challenges are women still facing in the 21st century and in combat roles as well? Extension activities might include further student research on notable women. Sarah provided examples of quite a few that certainly the students probably have not previously encountered in their textbooks previously. And students might also analyze the specific impact on wartime service to the suffrage movement. Sarah referenced specifically how women were able to draw upon everything that had been accomplished during the Civil War as basically further argumentation towards why they should have the right to vote. And then further, you could also have an extension activity examining wartime experience influencing broader women's rights. So even if we are not yet at the point of formalized suffrage rights, how and where do we see women's rights expanding in the late part of the 19th century and the earliest part of the 20th century? So there are beginning to be at that phase challenges for women to get into college, women to go into professions like medicine, like the law. And so those wartime experiences certainly do play an important role in that argument. And then as you would conclude with your students, they might have an opportunity to reflect on what has their learning meant for their overall understanding of the struggle for gender equality, and encouraging students to think about ways in which there have been and still are barriers to equality and what they might choose to do to address those barriers. All right, so all of this is to say, through the course of this whole evening's presentation, being able to weave together the struggle for women's rights, the roles of women in wartime, you can really provide a much more comprehensive understanding of women's involvement, women's understanding and participation in citizenship. And certainly you would be able to underscore the resilience and agency of women, both in the past and in the present day. So with that, I'll conclude my slides, and we would be happy to answer questions if anyone happens to have any questions. And in case you need a moment to think, I will mention we will be posting the recording of the presentation this evening on our YouTube channel. And we will also email it out so that you have that terrific PDF of resources shared by Sarah.
Thank you, Emily. I was just going to mention the same thing. In that PDF, you'll find links for some primary sources that might fit really nicely in with the suggestions and wonderful lesson plan that Emily just shared. If you're looking for a little more Civil War aspect, along with a lengthy list of biographies of women involved in the Civil War and some other resources as well. One thing that didn't come up in my part of the program, but might be an interesting one to mention, and there's some resources in that PDF for it, is the first and so far only woman to receive the United States Medal of Honor, Congressional Medal of Honor, is actually in the Civil War. Her name is Mary Walker. She was a doctor, which is quite a remarkable story. So she's one of those very few who's managed to push her way into that professional system. Certainly very few women, hardly any, had done that up to that point because of those barriers that Emily and I have talked about. But she is there. She does receive the Medal of Honor. She's told she has to give it back, and she says no. So she goes ahead and keeps it. So it's quite the story. So if you're looking for a particular case study to kind of look at all of these elements and a woman who's a very active role there, that might be a fun one to explore with a classroom.
I love that. Thank you so much. That's going to be a fun one, I think, to conclude our evening. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to future programs with the American Battlefield Trust and with Sarah coming up in the fall. We have some great programs coming up to match with some anniversaries of particular Civil War battles. So we are looking forward to that and appreciate your time and willingness to join us. So thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks.